I can usually draft a blurb and a catchy title to let you, via the office staff, know what the main idea of my upcoming sermon will be. Then, a couple weeks later, I will sit down to begin writing. Invariably, I then wonder how my idea can possibly be expanded to sermon length, which I admit is an imprecise, if not nebulous, way to measure time. But once I dive into the subject, before long I realize I won't be able to include everything I might like to share, and sometimes even resort to cutting out humorous anecdotes about Broadway musicals. For instance, about Fanny Brice, Barbra Streisand, and the song and sermon title, I'm the Greatest Star. In January, our Future Visions, Future Selves topic was death. And I set out to explore the topic via three aspects: societal, personal, and planetary. I spent a bit of time talking about the planetary aspect, including the Big Bang and the Big Crunch. It occurred to me that since this month's topic is a future among the stars, I might continue with some ideas I wasn't able to fit into that last sermon. In that sermon, I paired creation myths and metaphors with scientific theories. Now, I use the term myth not as in untruth, but as in a traditional story that sets out to explain the world around us and may be essentially true while not necessarily historically or scientifically accurate. In the Hebrew Bible, the Elohist writer put down, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." I suggested then that perhaps those words used an understanding that was possessed somewhere between 1000 and 800 BCE to describe the beginning of creation. Whereas today, we might say, approximately 13.8 billion years ago, the universe expanded faster than the speed of light for a fraction of a second, a period called cosmic inflation. When cosmic inflation stopped, the energy driving it transferred to matter and light, the Big Bang. Let there be light, and there was light. Just as many faith traditions believe God is omnipresent, present everywhere all at once, 70% of the universe is dark energy. I further theorize that dark energy may be or perhaps contain what many think of as God. Within Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan, natural events are considered to be manifestations of heavenly energy. I then described the theory some have put forth called the Big Crunch, when the expansion of the universe reverses and the universe collapses, described in the Hebrew Bible as, "Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it." And in the Hindu scriptures as, "We will attain permanent union with infinite intelligence." So now that I've caught you up, this is the spot I want to expand upon today, because I want to share why I don't think my interpretation will gain traction with most people, at least not most Americans. It would confirm that, yes, at some point after our death, we would be rejoined with a Creator, with our loved ones, and even with our childhood pet. But as energy and dust, we may or may not have any awareness of this. And I don't think most folks, nor their egos, would find that comforting. Many people, especially Americans, have very distinct ideas of not only what comes after death, but how they as individuals will experience it. Having eternal life in a communal sense, our energy big banging and big crunching forever, does not sound as comforting as walking through a paradise flowing with milk and honey. Even a UU paradise with almond milk and unfiltered fair trade honey. So people want to personally know and enjoy the events happening in the hereafter, And doing it communally and unknowingly, even if it would be, in a sense, what was hoped for, isn't going to fly. Living our lives personally or communally, inward-facing or outward-facing, if we begin as energy and stardust and return as such, then this individualization only happens for the brief time that we're here on earth as sentient beings. After we're born, then preoccupied with other things, then pass away. As Mary Oliver asked us, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Another of my all-time favorite quotes, which I have no doubt shared with you before, is this excerpt from a letter Albert Einstein wrote to Robert S. Marcus. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. We are all part of the universe, but a part unable to be separated from the rest. It seems that since we began communally and end up the same way, perhaps it would make sense to live that way as well. This realization is more in tune with Eastern philosophies than Western, which view the self as separate, individual entity. Eastern philosophies deny the existence of the independent entity of self that Westerners presume exists. Eastern philosophies view the self as an illusion, what Einstein referred to as a kind of optical delusion of our consciousness. They believe we are all interconnected and part of a greater universal whole, what Dr. King called the inescapable network of mutuality. One of our UU shared values states that we honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. Hindus believe that the Atman, or human soul, is a part of Brahman, the soul of God. Atman is part of Brahman and therefore cannot be a completely separate entity or self. Buddhists believe that we are all so interconnected that there can be no distinctions of self made between us, and the self is ultimately an illusion. So, how have we come to have an emphasis of self over community here in the West? Personal religiosity and communal religiosity have long been intercorrelated and endorsed by Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. Speaking in a broad sense, religion for Jews is about community and biological descent and about personal beliefs for Protestants. One of our Unitarian Universalist sources points to Jewish and Christian teachings, and we share an emphasis of community with our Jewish friends. I believe this informs our shared eagerness to work for social justice. We have parted ways with our Protestant friends, at least insofar as they have creeds to express their shared beliefs. We do not ask that you share a belief with those seated near you this morning, only that you agree to treat one another well. This is why Unitarian Universalism is covenantal, not creedal. So, why the shift to individualism? Scholars believe it was a development across several religions based on the concept that God is just. People came to believe it just wasn't fair that bad people would be treated the same as good people. Scholars tell us that by the 1st century, Judaism generally believed in judgment after death. It is suggested that the Jewish people adopted this belief from the Zoroastrians during the exile. But more likely, the concept that God is just and wouldn't just treat good and bad people the same developed across several religions. Others speculate that focus on individual salvation gained traction in the Middle Ages, when personal examination of conscience and confession became more mainstream and personal devotional practices came to be emphasized. Okay, now we jump the pond to what became the United States. After the Revolutionary War, the settlement of the American West began. Rugged individualism, as in people priding themselves on being independent and self-reliant, is a term coined by Herbert Hoover. Because the American frontier was generally sparsely populated and had very little infrastructure in place, individuals had to provide for themselves to survive in isolation from the larger community. This likely altered attitudes on the frontier in favor of individualistic thought over collectivism. Of course, the ideal of rugged individualism continues to be part of our culture. A Pew Research poll found that 57% of Americans valued a non-interventionist government over one that actively worked to further the needs of society. And the areas of the country that were part of the American frontier for longer and influenced by the frontier experience were found to be more supportive of Republican candidates. Now, this is just a personal observation, but it seems to me the further west you go, the less likely you are to avail yourself of public transportation. People want to be able to jump in their Ford F-150 and leave whenever they want, drive as fast as they want, and return when they want. Additionally, one scholar argues that the moral contradictions provided by the chattel slavery system in the American South was a major impetus in a theological shift that led to a much more individualized American approach to salvation. Let me break down that last sentence through a bit of a UU lens. While our history is by no means spotless regarding slavery and racism, during the 1800s, Unitarians were some of the most outspoken opponents of slavery. Second, our approach to salvation has been universalism, meaning the belief that everyone will eventually achieve salvation. Some Universalists have advised we need to learn to get along with even our enemies because we're going to spend eternity with them. Because of these concerns, or lack of them, it allows us to think more communally. Our covenants with one another and the world are emphasized, more than our beliefs. And creating beloved community here on earth is more important than what may or may not happen afterwards. So, why all this talk about individual versus community? 2 weeks ago, Reverend Colin encouraged us to be part of a community guided by compassion and empathy during times like these. Last week, Rosemary Bray McNatt gave us 6 actions we can take on behalf of others as well as ourselves. Along with leaning into our spirituality and cultivating joy, she advised us to create spaces of belonging. And I'll add one. Rather than doom scrolling on social media this week, go to our YouTube page and watch or rewatch her sermon. We are emphasizing and will continue to emphasize community because that is how we will make it through this mess, and I think you know the mess I'm talking about. And I also believe a lack of concern, if not downright disdain for others and community, helped get us in this mess. We got here because of people concerned with their own salvation over the saving of the community. We got here because of the settlers' allegedly divinely ordained destiny for westward expansion. We got here because of the white nationalism of both manifest destiny and slavery. We got here because of people believing they were better than others because of the color of their skin and how much property they own. Glennon Doyle, the author and queer activist, wrote, "Privilege is being born on third base. Ignorant privilege is thinking you're there because you hit a triple. Malicious privilege is complaining that those starving outside the ballpark aren't waiting patiently enough." So these how many years later, we're faced with an administration that is proudly doing all it can to denigrate and be cruel to anyone they see as below them, which means anyone other than straight, cisgender, white, wealthy men, and further elevate the egos and bloat the pocketbooks of themselves and those like them. More about that next week. Now, if you need examples of this racism and cruelty, there are many, and it's become so rampant that even the mainstream media have begun reporting on it. I'll cite but just two. 47's executive order this week repealed President Lyndon B. Johnson's 1965 executive order on non-discrimination and federal contracts. This means that the federal government no longer explicitly prohibits contractors from having segregated facilities, such as bathrooms and drinking fountains. Welcome to the 60s is no longer just a song from the musical Hairspray. According to the UN World Food Program, it would take $40 billion a year to end world hunger by 2030. Elon Musk is currently worth approximately $321 billion. It fluctuates a couple billion a day depending on how his stock's doing. It isn't just choosing to not end world hunger. He has eliminated programs that were in place just 3 months ago to give aid to the poorest and hungriest. This is what Reverend Colin has called the politics of cruelty. 2 weeks ago, he spoke to the lack of empathy currently being not only demonstrated but applauded. I will simply add this quote by Gustav Mark Gilbert, the American psychologist best known for his writings containing observations of high-ranking Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials. He wrote, "I told you once that I was searching for the nature of evil. I think I've come close to defining it: a lack of empathy. It's the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow man. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy." So here we are. We have a self-centered religiosity which has morphed into Christian nationalism versus a religiosity concerned with others and community, and which has become looked down upon by the right as woke and weak. Stories are surfacing about those who voted for 47 who have lost their jobs. They are appealing to him for their job to be spared because they like what he promised to do, they just don't like it happening to them. They do not realize we are all in this together. I would sooner engage the politics of compassion and empathy. I agree with labor leader and civil rights activist Cesar Chavez, who said, "We cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity for our community. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others, for their sakes and for our own." So, if an overemphasis on self and ego got us here, how might our community help us while we extricate ourselves from this mess? A community has been defined as a network of people with shared values or intentions. I like to think this church fits that description pretty well. But it's also well reported that there's a so-called loneliness epidemic, with people spending more time alone and less with others. Despite, or because of, being online more, we feel more disconnected. But belonging to a community provides the interpersonal support that human beings naturally need to survive and thrive. Having a strong community creates a support system in times of need or crisis, not just when the country seems to be pulled apart at the seams, but when you need someone to watch your kid, drive you to the airport, or run to HEB when you're sick. Being a part of a community isn't just a convenience. It's a reassurance to know you're not alone. Of course, admitting we're only human and need the support of others takes a bit of humility as well as admitting we're vulnerable, especially for rugged individuals like us. But that's another sermon. At some point after our death, I believe we'll be rejoined with the Creator and loved ones in cosmic community as energy and stardust. At that point, power and wealth will have meant nothing. Once we are again all stardust, no one will be the greatest star. What will matter and live on is the kindness and compassion that we exhibited as we embraced others and our community during our brief time here. Amen, and so be it.